sometimes we read or we have the sense that multilingualism is far better than monolingualism in terms of political inclusion, in terms of political representation, in terms of diversity. That's maybe the key word of multilingualism.
And I think this idea is the question is, where does this idea come from? For sure, the nation states model, the way we understand them, especially in Europe, in the big countries of Europe, is based on the idea of one nation, one language, with a very strong homoglossic, monoglot ideology, which makes you as a citizen, if you speak the language of the state, right? And we know that the whole history of many of those nation states is based on a monolingual ideology, which we also know the consequences of that, which means everyone that is not speaking the language of the states is very likely not to be recognized as a citizen of the state. And this is a very pervasive ideology that we need to continue to fight. So my point is to say, yes, multilingualism is one way of disentangling or questioning a monoglot nationalistic ideology. However, as I said just before, it's not because you reclaim multilingualism that it does de facto solve the very ideological logic behind it. So you can get, and this is why Switzerland is interesting, you can get officially multilingual states, but that by the end of the day will still have and relying on very normative ideologies of language, or reproducing geographically monolingual ideologies. So when people say multilingualism is the answer of a problem, the problem being monoglot ideologies, I would be careful. I would really be careful about that. Because then the question is it really the differentiation between monolingualism versus multilingualism that is the key issue? Or is it the ways in which we use language, any kind of, could be monolingual, could be multilingual, could be even varieties of language, in order to produce social differences? So my conviction is that you can produce social differences even if you reclaim multilingualism. So multilingualism does not prevent you to make differences on the basis of language. You see? Okay. So my feeling is that we have maybe to quickly consider that if you move on from a monolingual ideology to a multilingual idea or imagination of the nation, you contribute to solve the problem. I do think it makes a contribution. It disentangles a kind of boundedness of language and the nation, or language and culture, or language and mind, right? That could be two entities that are completely bounded and that are, basically only unitarian, right? So claiming that languages are not unitarian, or that there is something like linguistic diversity, that de facto there is something like multilingualism, of course, does something in order to fight against that ideology. But when we believe that the answer is replacing that ideology by another idea, which would be multilingualism, I think it prevents us to look at the effect on what those ideas on multilingualism does to people.
Okay, how do we tackle on this kind of association of monolingualism versus multilingualism?
Okay, so maybe that's the problem, is the versus.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe one of the problem is the opposition we might make between monolingualism versus multilingualism. Why not considering that language is a powerful instrument in order to create differences? Language as a, let's take that as a generical term. Language could be one language, English, one specific language, or French, or Spanish, or whatever. A language could be an accent, a variety, or a standard. But it could be a repertoire. It could be multilingualism. When you take language as a set of practice, and if you consider that those set of practices are never neutral, that neutrality in terms of language practices doesn't exist. Because if you believe that speaking, writing, communicating is always anchored in particular socio-political, historical constellations, there is always value, evaluation, hierarchy attached to any forms of linguistic practices. If you believe in that, you are not in the opposition between monolingualism versus multilingualism. You ask the question of what in language makes a difference? What in language is picked up by whom in order to create what kind of differences? And not only differences, because what I'm interested in is not differences, is how differences are transformed into inequalities, right? So I think that we should disentangle in the same way we have disentangled monolingualism, and I think sociolinguistics has been super productive in showing what monolingual ideologies produce. I think we should apply the same for multilingualism, not taking for granted that multilingualism per se is ideologically free, neutral, and better, right? So I think this is the way we, coming back to your points, and how do we look at these two, monolinguism versus multilingualism. I think the question makes me think that maybe we should get rid of the versus, and ask ourselves every time we look at languages, what in that particular set of practices is used by whom in order to produce what kind of differences that are turned into inequalities.
Okay, Alex, and what's the place of your work with Monica Heller, Pride and Profit, in this framework, in this set of problems, this perspective of language, of languages, of culture, and of modern politics even?
Right, yeah. I think if I come back to the point I just mentioned before, the book and the work we've been doing for quite a long time now is definitely trying to better understand how the political economies in which we are all operating actually impacts the way we see language, but how also language practices are evaluated within particular socioeconomic conditions. So what we realized when we were, both of us, working on different terrain, Monica has been done a lot of research in Canada, which is also bilingual, officially bilingual states, which is way more than just bilingual, of course, and Switzerland, officially quadrilingual state. When we were exactly looking at how, especially minority communities, were trying, to survive, exist, the power relations between the different communities that are always there, we came across some interesting phenomenon like community trying to use arguments, economic arguments, in order to promote a community, a particular linguistic community. We're observing that people were hoping very much that the economic argument will bring them more recognition, more resources, and definitely more existence, more generally.
Visibility?
More visibility. And we have been super interested to understand that better, because we, at least I can talk for me better than for Monica, for me that was something, I didn't look at it before encountering these type of practices during my ethnographic fieldwork. And I have to say, I was also questioning, I wasn't unsure what was going on, when I was, for instance, seeing that in a bilingual industrial region in Bienne that was facing high unemployment, that was facing problems in their way of reinventing themselves economically due to different kind of economic crisis, and where suddenly you see popping up this idea, we have a multilingual population. So because they were located at the border between Francophone and German speakers, with a lot of traditional immigration from Italy. So why not, reinventing our place as a place of multilingualism and attracting call centers, communication services to our place, because we have that particular people who have the linguistic skills to do the job.
That workforce or word force.
The word force, exactly. The parole d'oeuvre. So and I was observing that, this is a region where my family actually is living nearby. So I was observing that, saying the incentive of the city, to attract people. And one of the things that they were using to attract people was saying, look, here you can come, we will help you with the taxes. But look, we have a unique multilingual parole d'oeuvre, word force. And this is great for you because you will be able to accomplish your work. It happens that this particular labor force used to be exactly the working class that lost their jobs. And of course, the city needed to have that forces needed to move beyond the high unemployment they were facing. So when I was looking at that and say, wow, they are really, really bringing forward the economic argument as a central aspect of their marketing strategy. But then, of course, I was suspicious I was questioning, what does that mean? What does that mean if you rely on that form of economy, and what does it mean when you turn something like language into an economic resource? Who is able to do that? For whom? In whom interests? So the book comes from these different kind of experiences we were observing, and we thought we need to better understand that, and then we need to also connect that with a better understanding on the capitalistic logics that are behind those processes. Also because we felt and we saw that there were tensions between that discourse on making multilingual resources and economic resources and some other discourses that were way more anchored in identity politics, in the idea of language as a cultural good or resources, that sometimes these discourses were coexisting, but that also sometimes they were, clashing. So that's if you want, one of the very first observation we made, where we thought we need to investigate that.
So it sounds like more like a point of departure than a goal, than the point towards you would like to go. So what's coming after the pride and profit approach, first approach?
Well, what comes after the book is the interesting, challenging sometimes, sometimes even a bit depressing critique that you get after the book. So people reading this attempt, this project, because the book is also a project, even if it looks like an end product. People sometimes adopting ideas that we don't see in the book. Not saying they are not, or maybe we were sometimes unclear, but people suddenly, you know, coining these two terms, pride and profit. So this is some interesting moments when you see people taking it up, but you still see moments where people are engaging critically with that, asking questions about, well, is that something that is changing, or is that the same process ever and ever, coming up ever and over again, just re-semioticized? The key question was about how much Marxism is in that book, and how much engagement, for instance, if you talk about commodity, if you talk about capitalism, how much engagement theoretically you have with Marxism, where also we can see people who considered the book was too Marxist, and some people say, no, I mean, this is not enough. This is not. I mean, you need a solid engagement with Marxism. And also people more from the economy of language, since we have insisted a lot, I think, in that book that political economy matters, right? Who are considering that our understanding of the economy was not a solid economic understanding, which is a critique that I take it absolutely, because I believe we don't try to do any economic statements. So we take another point than what economists of language would make. So I think the book has launched a lot of discussions for us, had critiques, interrogations, and I think this is a privilege in many ways, but it's also a moment where you have to ask yourself, well, what are we doing with that? So sometimes you reply in another text, you know, where we try to tackle on the critique, try to make something out of it. Is that convincing, not convincing? But to me, I would say on a more intellectual level, what the book, there is a strong conviction that I still have where the book was some kind of key moments, was that we need political economy in order to understand what is going on with language. That we cannot get rid of the political economy. And trying to get rid of the political economy is getting blind, or, you know, having some blind spots of possible interpretations that we are facing, especially if you are, not everyone has to be interested in understanding the relation between language and social inequality. So what I want to do and continue working on is working on that idea of political economy. What kind of political economy are we talking about? How are we able to study, observe, analyze, interpret what political economy does? And also, I think, you know, the key question I have now is, how can I myself better integrate in my work a more solid and more theoretically and empirically anchored understanding on the transformations of capitalistic logics and their impact or their interrelation with the process of making value and making differences around language. I just wanted to come back to political economy. And one of my concerns I have in terms of knowledge production and also in terms of sociolinguistics more generally is how can we continue or not forget to keep in mind that one of the reasons it is important to look at language and society is in order to understand how language participates in the production of social inequality. And I believe this is a point that gets sometimes forgotten or just taken for granted. We believe that because you look at linguistic diversity, you de facto will, address a question of inequality, and sometimes I get the feeling that the term can even disappear. Inequality can disappear in texts, in discussion, because diversity implies that we do something around inequality. And I believe that political economy obliges us to question not diversity per se, but to bring us back to the key question about inequalities and the uneven distribution of resources. So coming back to your question about what's after the book was in a way programmatic, okay? But I think what the book has helped me to consider is really to dig into those processes more empirically, which means also empirically but also historically. So when I was saying before that I get the feeling I need to understand better the ways in which certain forms of capitalistic logic impacts our speaking life, if you want. It also addressed the question of how those logics evolved over the time and how those logic gets configured differently in different spaces that have different link or relation to capitalism. And I think this is something the book does not address, right? And I remember a first conversation with Jorge Alves. I was saying, well, I don't know if you remember, I read the book and, as a Colombian, right? You were telling me, as a Colombian, I don't know what to do with the book, right? Implying, and I took it like that probably the book is not echoing necessarily what you can observe in your place or where you are coming from. Of course, my argument would say, I think there are things that are happening in Colombia too that might be also interesting to look at from this kind of late capitalistic formation. But I also take it as a very important aspect that we can't, or I don't want to claim that late capitalistic logics operates in the same way everywhere, with the same kind of salience, or with the same kind of consequences. And I think this is something the book has not addressed because it was programmatic, but I think this is something I definitely want to push forward and to question, where it also brings me to the Glottopolitica, and what also the Glottopolitica in many ways offer me egoistically is really to go back to the fact that, okay, if we claim there is historicity in what is going on in our life, right, a claim that everyone is doing basically, but then we need to look at that historicity seriously and not just claim that it is historically situated. So what are those histories in which language gets embedded into within colonial, post-colonial, capitalistic, late capitalistic logics, right? So that's one of an important point, I think, from the Glottopolitica that helps me for my program, if you will. And the second aspect is also really to consider that most of the work that we conduct, that I conduct, is located in Europe, right? Or in Canada, or in the United States. If you look at the book itself, it's all Europe and North American. And we knew that. We knew that it was definitely an issue. But we assumed that issue because we needed to try to grasp what was going on in the places that we better understand, right? But now I think I need to confront, I need to have exactly this kind of comment saying, well, from my perspective as a Colombian, what does that book tell me? And it's not obvious that it tells you something. So my question would be then, okay, why? And what does it mean for the enterprise in terms of knowledge production if it doesn't mean anything, right? So, of course, this is something that I cannot answer now, but this is something really I want to continue thinking.
Okay, so Alex, you have talked and you have wrote a lot about the needs of bringing into our frameworks the political economy perspective. And I would like to link that to a kind of sociolinguistics, the critical one, that it's intended not to explain only the inequalities, but to engage with them, with the communities even. For instance, at school or at labor exploitation. How do you see this connection, and how would you project it into real settings?
Well, maybe first of all, I think what it also offers is a solid engagement with the way we produce knowledge. So the political economy perspective obliges us also to ask ourselves in what kind of particular socioeconomic conditions are we producing knowledge, and where our knowledge might also be sometimes, reproductive of division of labor, gender division of labor between, for instance, women doing empirical stuff and men theory, right? So I think this is also something we need to somehow apply to our own work, to our own way of working as an academic. So I think there are moments in which we as academic do reproduce forms of inequality in the way we do scholarly work. Okay. And I think this is an important aspect. The other aspects, to me, I see political economy as productive when it comes to identify key moments in the life of people in which language is the terrain for the making of differences. Let's say school. I think political economy is interesting because it obliges to look at the structure of the school, the logic of the evaluation system, the selection processes. So when we work on school, for instance, we have to look at those moments where the language becomes a terrain in order to produce something that is unequal. I'm giving you one small example. And I think this happened in the States too, those moments where the kids and the parents get invited to the school, where the teacher talks to the parents about the future, the expectations they may have, at the moments where there is selection processes to be tracked in different hierarchized clusters. When we look at those moments and we look at the ways in which teachers speak to parents about language skills, about multilingualism, or about deficits, you see those moments are where the language becomes a central element of making differences. The point I'm trying to make here is that exactly those moments needs to be taken as particular salient situations to talk about with teachers, to talk about even with parents sometimes, where we can use those moments in order to show the teachers what they are themselves producing, not as teacher, but as a member of a system. Because the teacher themselves, they do their job the best they can. So it's not saying that the fault is the teacher, but the teacher are part of a broader systems of value that students and parents are somehow conditioned by. And I think this would be an example where we knew, I would say in terms of pedagogy, it's maybe those moments that are as important even more than having a critical pedagogy in the classroom. Because those moments are consequential. Those moments makes a difference. If a kid gets to be tracked in a certain place where we see constant class, racialized and linguistic reproduction, like the working class, especially in Europe, being always in those sectors of the school that is the less prestigious, this is not just coming from nowhere. It comes from different moments and chain of moments where people are categorized and placed in a certain way. So I would say that this is a way of acting and proposing to act at different moment in school than only in the classroom, which is, I believe, something that has mostly been proposed by critical pedagogy. Right? If I take question of labor, as I know I've been working a lot about labor, not because I'm interested, I think labor is interesting per se, it's because labor is a central aspect of the organization of our life, especially in contemporary Western societies. So when you look at labor, the key questions, which are all questioned, by the way, in sociolinguistics, is how does it come that certain person gets access to what kind of position, and how language, communication, language skills gets part of that evaluation process and placement. But labor is also a space where exploitation is at stake. So what we can do and think of is looking at those moments in the labor processes where exploitative processes are at stake and documenting them and discussing them with different kind of people. Now I'm saying that, but I'm telling you also my big frustration that you can discuss, you can present, you can try even to think about possible alternatives, but sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes people have no interest in discussing those matters, and sometimes there is no solution. But then I would argue it's not because there is no immediate solution that we shouldn't continue trying to better understand those key moments in our lives, where language matters, in positive but also mostly in negative way, and continue thinking for potential and possible alternatives. So criticality for me is identifying, understanding, analyzing those moments where power relation and inequality is happening. And those moments where exactly the production of inequality is articulated to language, which doesn't mean all the time. So language doesn't always play a role in those processes, but when it does, what does it? And I think this is one of the criticality I see as interesting while taking a political economy perspective.
Okay, I would like now to ask you about the perception of how those topics or those problems are addressed in Europe, in the academic environment you work in, like the Francophone world maybe, and your recent experience being here in the United States working in New York with a wider group of social scientists. I would like you to elaborate more about the perception of how academy is addressing the topic there and here.
Okay, well, that's a super tough. I don't know if I can say something on that, but okay, I've been working quite a lot on a historiography of Francophone sociolinguistics in Europe. I've been very interested to understand how questions of criticality, power relations, inequality have been addressed, but how they disappeared or how they were reconfigured. So when I am in Europe, and Europe is super heterogeneous, by the way,
Yes.
there is, and the field is heterogeneous too. So even the term critical sociolinguistics is super heterogeneous. So I see the same heterogeneity here and there. So in terms of labeling, I see the same processes that people try to label, but also I see the diversity of understanding of labels. So that's something I think inherent to knowledge production, but also to the academic market more generally. So this is no big difference, I would say. I have the feeling that addressing the question of language inequalities in my own environment is difficult because, as what I said earlier, there is a tendency to go rather for diversity, exploring linguistic diversity, exploring how we can make linguistic diversity recognizable, valued, appreciated, of course with a strong impetus of fighting against the pervasive and negative effect of monolingual ideologies. But I do see also the difficulty to address and to put in the center of our enterprise inequalities. And maybe because of the transformation of the field, that's a hypothesis, I'm not completely sure, but if you look at France, what was very important in the mid-70s in sociolinguistics, that was also the political project around language. You need to imagine at the time in France, a lot of academics used to be member of the Communist Party. That doesn't make them necessarily Marxists, but you know, the Communist Party gives a form of orientation, coloration on what topics are legitimate, right? And I think inequalities were definitely at the center of the program. Exactly because that was a time where question of inequalities were part of the academic program more generally, right? You see also the kind of what people investigated at the time was super interesting. You know, some scholars have investigated unions, communication practices in unions or union speech. Some people have very quickly invested into looking at the workplace and the working class. The working class has been a definitive important subject in France at the early moments of sociolinguistics. School, of course, but you know, school in terms of what does school producing and reproducing and how language is part of that reproduction system. So that was issues of literacy were framed also in question of class, which that was a very important moment. The collapse of the Communist Party in France, which is linked to the information, the awareness of what was going on in the Soviet Union, right? Which brought within the collapse of the Communist Party also had a central impact on the ways in which those topics were or not legitimate. And I do see, which is something that should be more explored for me, I can't really completely grasp it, but I see something happening at that moment where certain topics were not anymore in the forefront. At the same time, those moments are also combined with other kind of postmodern trends where hybridity were preferred than as inequalities, for instance. And you see those different moments that also informs the kind of knowledge production in France. And I would say in the Francophone European world. So of course in the US, that question is completely different. Imagine at the same moment the Communist Party is omnipresent in academia in the States. Imagine, right? I mean, I don't even have to draw a picture. That was impossible. That was impossible to think in that way, because politically it was impossible, right? That doesn't mean that there were no impetus around inequalities, but the framing of those issues were different. Of course, what puzzles me when I come here and the kind of tension I see between the US and Europe is the question of race, which has a complete different historical academic roots here and there. In France, for instance, even using the term race is basically still now complicated. Here it's omnipresent. I mean, I don't think you can do academia without questioning the issue of race, which for me, from the perspective I'm coming from, I think it's very important to realize, and to bring that into my understanding, to bring that better into my understanding of my own field and field work. But at the same time, some of the concern I have in terms of the production here is how can we have a better articulation of race and class, which tend sometimes to conflate, but also sometimes the question of class gets difficult to discuss in the North American academic knowledge production. So when I was here 6 months, I was always questioning myself, where is class? When I go back to my own environment, where is race? And I think this is very productive, right? So I'm not claiming that people working on race ignore class. And I'm not claiming that I ignore race, I have ignored race. But I do think that it creates a perspective, right, that is legitimate, but where we could somehow also try to articulate, in many ways, better. And I think this is also one of the big differences I see.
So, Alex, we had a great time having a conversation with you. We really appreciate your time and your disposition to share with us and with all our community at the GC this conversation. As you know, the GC is your home. We are your fellows and classmates. And well, thank you very much for being here with us.
Yeah, thank you, Jorge, and thank you, Lara. It was great. Thanks a lot for the super interesting questions.
So, Alex, you had a great time at the GC. Tell us a bit about that experience.
Okay, that was a fantastic time. GC for me is synthesized in 3 words: engagement. These institutions, the students, the professor I met really displayed a solid engagement in all the sectors of activity of what academic does: theory building, empirical research, and political engagement. A superb community of practice with groups of scholars who are willing to share, willing to exchange ideas. I have been terribly privileged to meet wonderful and brilliant students. So the GC for me is the place to be.
Thank you.